The Dolphins have one of the biggest needs at wide receiver, and there's one name that keeps coming up. But could this deal actually happen, and will the Dolphins make this deal? Let's discuss that now. The name I'm talking about is Brian Thomas Jr., the Jags wide receiver who's entering his third year. I think the reason this could happen is because the Jaguars wide receiver room is so crowded. Looking at that receiver room, we have Brian Thomas Jr. We don't know where exactly he's going to be on the depth chart. You have Parker Washington, who had 850 receiving yards last year, Jacoby Myers, Travis Hunter, and they drafted two receivers in the sixth round of this draft with Josh Cameron and CJ Williams. This room is so stacked, and them drafting those two receivers in the sixth round makes me question what they're doing with this receiver room. We know Travis Hunter might be shifting from between cornerback and receiver this year. Not exactly sure where he's majority going to play. Obviously, coming off that injury last year, which took him out for back half of the season. But Miami's receiver room is also very lackluster. Maybe on the other side, I do think they have some stars on that receiver room. Don't get me wrong, I think Jalen Tolbert's going to have an amazing season for Miami this year. But you have Jalen Tolbert, Malik Washington, you have Tutu Atwell, and then you have that rookie receiver who's doing great in training camp right now, Caleb Douglas, who I think is going to be a very good receiver for Miami this year, probably their leading receiver in yards. But this just makes sense, I feel like, at midseason. I think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to maybe want an extension at the end of this year because drafted players are able to get an extension after their third year in the NFL. So Brian Thomas Jr. is eligible to get an extension after this year. And if the Jags don't want to give him that extension, we could see him maybe request a trade. While I'm filming this right now, Bijan just got his extension because he just finished his third year last year. And Gibbs is also looking for that extension. So with players looking for the extension, they might request a trade there, and we could see Thomas Jr. want out of Jacksonville if they don't want to keep him long term. We also had talks with Thomas Jr. earlier this year. Maybe him heading to the Pats. There was a lot of talk about him going to the Commanders, with that Commanders room, a receiver room, a little lackluster with McLaurin as their star receiver. But what would the Dolphins have to give up in order to get this deal done? Well, I think that it would take a second round pick and some more. Obviously, for Jalen Waddle earlier this offseason, we saw him get sent to Denver for a first, a third, and a fourth round swap with Miami. And I think Brian Thomas Jr. is a level below Jalen Waddle, and that makes sense. We saw A.J. Brown get shipped for a first round pick in 2028. But Brian Thomas Jr. I don't think is on the level of those receivers right now. I know he's a little younger than them at the age of 23. But I think Thomas Jr. could go for a second. And I think that Miami would be willing to give up a second. Obviously, Miami is in a rebuilding stage right now after losing Tua, Waddle, Tyreek all last offseason. Now they're hitting that reset button, and we see them rebuilding now with Malik Willis at the helm. But what would Miami be willing to give up? I think they'd be willing to give up a second. And the next thing I think they could give up is Zach Sealer, your not star defensive tackle, but your starting defensive tackle. Obviously, you have Kenneth Grant and Jordan Phillips, who the Miami coaching staff has said has looked amazing this preseason. But, Jalen Phillips is 30 years old. He's entering his age 31 NFL season. And looking at the Jacksonville Jaguars depth chart, defensive tackle is one of the weaker positions on that team. You have Eric Armstead, who's a very solid defensive tackle. But on the other defensive tackle, you have Devon Hamilton, who in his total NFL career only has 5.5 sacks. And that career has been a solid, long career. A 6-year season, 5.5 sacks is not the best from what we see for a lot of defensive tackles. So maybe a second Zach Sealer could get this deal done for Miami. Now, would they be willing to give up Zach Sealer is another question. He's obviously one of the veterans on Miami's defense entering this year. But I think they have solid depth at defensive tackle, Miami. I think they have that's one of the positions they have the most depth at, maybe other than running back. But another player I think Miami would be willing to give up is Jalen Wright. There was a lot of conversations with Jalen Wright in Miami at the deadline last year, wondering if Wright would move on. Obviously, Miami drafted Ollie Gordon, who I think is Miami's running back too, obviously behind Devon Achane. But Wright might want out of Miami if he's not getting the playtime he thinks he deserves. And obviously Jacksonville lost Travis Etienne last year in free agency. He went to New Orleans, and now their starting running back is Byshell too. And we aren't sure exactly what he's going to look like. We'll see with the first couple weeks this year. We saw him kind of split 50-50, maybe 40-60 with Etienne last year. Two, and obviously the second-year player from Virginia Tech last year having 300 yards on the ground. But running back two is Chris Rodriguez. We saw him at Washington last year. But this running back room could use a little work, and the defensive tackle room could use a little work. And I think for Miami, the positions that Jacksonville really needs are the positions that Miami has extra of. So Miami could be willing to give up some of their backups, some of their extra room to get Brian Thomas Jr. to propel to that wide receiver one. Now, we did hear Jacksonville say they weren't explicitly looking to move Brian Thomas Jr., But that doesn't mean they're not willing. They won't. That doesn't mean he's off the table. That just means they weren't shopping him like the Eagles were A.J. Brown or the Dolphins were with Jalen Waddle. But I think he's on the table, and I think at midseason, where the Jags stand, I think is a big position where Miami stands. I think if Miami's sitting around that 2-3 wins, we could see this move get done. I think Miami does have a possibility of getting some early wins, especially against the Raiders week 1, and then obviously the Jets early in the season. But if Jacksonville's not a playoff contender, if they're not sitting at a very high playoff spot, I mean, I could see them. Jacksonville has a mediocre schedule, obviously playing the Browns, Broncos, Pats, Bengals, Eagles, Texans in the first couple weeks. Pretty tough. Obviously, the Browns, probably the easiest out of those teams. But with the Jags maybe being under 500 and willing to ship Brian Thomas to maybe get Travis Hunter some more playing time, Parker Washington, who I think is one of the most underrated players in the NFL, some more playing time, Jacoby Myers, who they brought over from Vegas last year in the trade deadline, to get those guys more playing time, I think we could see Jacksonville do that. Now, do I think Jacksonville is looking to shop Brian Thomas right now? No, not right now. But at the trade deadline, mid-season, could this happen? Now, Miami is rebuilding, as I said, and those second-round picks could have a solid amount of capital for them. But I think Brian Thomas Jr. would definitely be worth it. Maybe you have to give up Brian Thomas Jr., or maybe you have to give up a second round and a fourth round, or a second round and a fifth round. I don't think a first rounder is exactly what Jackson would be looking for, because we've seen high-end receivers go for those first rounders like Waddle and Brown, as I said. But I think a second and maybe some more, maybe Zach Sealer, maybe Jalen Wright, maybe a little bit more draft capital, like a fourth or a fifth, sixth round pick, could push that over for Jacksonville to accept that. Because we know Brian Thomas Jr. did have a bit of a sophomore slump last year after an amazing first-year season. But could Miami look to take Brian Thomas Jr., to trade for Brian Thomas Jr.? I think they could. I think this would be an amazing move for Miami, really adding to that wide receiver room. He would be their new star, their new young development player. Comment down below your thoughts on this, and subscribe for more football content.